Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you very much for having me. And like Lynn, I realise that you will have already opened the conference with an acknowledgement of country, but I wanted to acknowledge that I live and work on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. So as Claudette said, I'm a lecturer here at Monash, but I am a former principal and also was an out-of-field teacher myself in a number of different ways. So I kind of really have a lot of sympathy for the summit today, and really pleased to be able to share some of these issues from the principal's perspective as well. Andrew Pierpoint, who's the president of the Australian Secondary Principals Association, asked me to come and represent the work that we do together today because he was unavailable. And so the kind of perspectives that I'm drawing on are really synthesizing the ASPA perspective, because we had a bit of a chat about the questions that I was going to be answering today, as well as the research that we've been doing for the last few years on issues of attraction, support and retention for leaders. So of the three questions that we were given today, I'm going to focus really on the first two, which was about the pressures that school leaders face when staffing schools and classrooms and the broader implications of that, as well as a focus on school improvement policy in particular and how it can potentially be a little bit more responsive to some of these issues. So when we think about the pressures that school leaders face when staffing schools and classrooms, I think it's important to think about this through two different lenses. So there are significant pressures and practicalities in the kind of everyday work of leaders, or the day-to-day work of leading a school. And then there are also effects on the bigger picture's work of school leadership and school improvement efforts. So I'm going to talk about each of these in turn, but I think it's also really important to recognise first that these challenges are being added on top of the work of principals, and I just wanted to take a few minutes to set that context a little bit more and share that principal perspective that ASPA is very much about advocating for and recognising as well. So before we understand the pressures of staffing a school, as I said, we need to recognise that these pressures are adding to and existing alongside already really pressurised workloads and intensity for principals. So there's a lot of resonances with what Lynn was talking about before with what I was planning on talking about now. For example, I'm going to focus largely on the experiences of principals in hard to staff schools, and that's really rural schools and schools with high levels of complex needs that are the kind of types of schools that we've been doing our research with. They have been shown to face much more broader challenges in their leadership work than principals of advantage schools do, and you would probably expect the leafy green schools, as we call them, to face fewer challenges in this respect in terms of staffing hard to staff schools or out of field teaching as well. Another part of the bigger puzzle, which I think is really important, is that while I'm talking today about hard to staff schools in terms of staffing teachers, it's really important to recognise that the principal role itself is increasingly hard to staff. There are plenty of leadership jobs going with no applicants or no suitable applicants. There is much higher turnover of principals in schools, and we're seeing an increase in precarious contract positions for school leaders as well. So changes, in recent years across the country, because we do take a national focus on this, have pushed to make the principal position even more precarious in some places. There are suggestions about 3-year performance-based contracts for leaders, which are slightly shorter than some policies that are actually already in existence in Australian jurisdictions. So when a school improvement cycle is, 4 or 5 years, and we're talking about keeping principals for 3 years, there's some really significant flow-on effects for that long-term work and vision that a leader is able to actually, bring people together to enact. There are a lot of reasons for the fact that there are fewer people who want to take on these leadership roles. In part, it's because of the recognition of the pressurised environments that are facing everyone in schools, but also I think the well-publicised consequences for leaders' health and well-being of actually doing the job, and that's what my own research has been focusing on in the last few years. So the challenges of finding principals for hard to staff schools does really matter for a number of reasons. So first of all, the evidence from international research tells us that hard to staff schools do face higher rates of principal turnover, and that results in a higher likelihood, as Lynn said, of inexperienced leaders as well. Principal turnover has really serious effects on community cohesion, on student achievement. And we also know, as I'm sure is no surprise here to anyone, that higher principal turnover also results in higher teacher turnover as well. So because of all these things put together, principal turnover has got really significant effects on student outcomes, because we know that the longer principal is in a school, the longer or the more stable, I guess, that school improvement journey tends to be. So you need time for school improvement to really be embedded within a school. We also know that principal turnover tends to have more harmful effects on vulnerable communities. So research from the United States in particular, and I've put some references on the slide here, have highlighted the fact that there are negative consequences of the higher turnover that we see in marginalised communities. And we see that echoed here in Australia as well. So those students who would most benefit from stable and experienced leadership are often experiencing, or most often experiencing, the negative consequences of principal turnover as well. So that is an important piece of the puzzle. And turning back to issues of hard to staff schools for teachers, of course, if those schools have higher rates of inexperienced leaders, it also means that they don't necessarily have the strong networks that they need to be able to draw upon to know how to deal with these issues. So they don't have the body of experience as leaders to draw upon themselves to support teachers who are teaching out of field. They also don't have the same sense of autonomy that principals who are more experienced do in dealing with these issues. So ASPA, as a partnership, we've researched autonomy and principals' experiences across Australia, and we found a number of things that relate to these issues. So first of all, when we're talking about policy, principals generally have a fairly significant amount of autonomy, but in practice, it doesn't always feel like that, or it doesn't turn out that way for a number of reasons. Career stage and experience make a huge difference in terms of how much autonomy a principal feels that they have. Knowing how far a rule can be bent before it's broken is something that you learn along the way as a school leader. You also need the time to build up a bank of goodwill when you're trying to make difficult decisions or you're trying to do something different. You need to learn the kind of hidden rules of the game. So principals in our study particularly talk about knowing the hidden rules or the tricks of working with staffing around things like how to ensure they get prioritised, or how to have more autonomy over the process and the selection of particular teachers as well. So there are a lot of tensions of autonomy for principals in hard to staff schools in particular. So I've already mentioned that often they're inexperienced, and that means they don't necessarily know how much autonomy they have. Sometimes they're left alone because it's too difficult to deal with them or the problems that their school has. And that was certainly something that I have experienced as a principal myself. On the other end of the spectrum, they might be completely micromanaged, and that then impacts on how they are able to respond to these challenges. Or often they're in the middle and they experience, a little bit of both. So while some principals in hard to staff schools are able to do really creative things with staffing structures or thinking outside the box, others feel very bound to what they see as the box that they're in. And that box is quite different for everybody. And that's what, as Lynn mentioned before, is part of the challenge. There's no easy way to understand what this looks like for principals right across the state or the country or whatever, because everyone is working in such different ways. And of course, this all affects issues of out of field teaching. So when we're thinking about staffing or timetabling, professional development, or just being creative in how we deal with these issues. The second thing that our research has also really demonstrated is the intensification and extension of work for school principals. So principals in our studies largely feel overworked, and they describe their workloads as unmanageable. And Philip Riley's work suggests that 1 in 3 Australian principals' health and wellbeing is at serious risk. In Victoria, principals are shown to be at greater risk of mental health injury than other school staff are. And so I'm sharing these issues to recognise that the pressures created by out-of-field teaching and what, the hard to staff more broadly aren't occurring in a vacuum. They're adding further pressure and workload to what is already an overwhelming workload and role for principals. So back to my slide, in terms of the practicalities and the pressures of that out-of-field teaching and hard to staff school, there's the really basic day-to-day stuff, like the time and effort that it actually takes to search for teachers. So for people who already don't feel like they have enough hours in the day to focus on what they see as their core business, which I'll talk about a little bit more later, this is a really significant issue. There are also the financial costs from schools' own budgets. So a number of the schools, rural schools that I work with, will fly teachers up for a weekend to give them a sense of what they're coming to. And while that's seen as a really important investment, it's also like money straight out of their bank that would be going to other things in other schools. There's a quote that I've got up here by a principal who wrote a AARE blog not that long ago about teacher shortages and the challenges of finding teachers. And he said, the kids don't cease to exist just because recruitment can't find a teacher. So the principals in our studies really feel a deep responsibility to their schools and their communities. And our participants, one of our participants described it as a heavy burden when they feel like they're not able to meet those needs for their communities. The flow-on effects of the current pressurised environments can also be seen in wider systematic issues and approaches towards these challenges. So one study that I looked at about principal attraction and retention, we spoke more broadly about attraction and retention of educators. And I worked really closely with some HR and staffing managers who had been in their roles for a number of decades. They described the challenges that they had experienced and the changes they had seen over time in the way they were able to do their work. So they used to really know and work closely with schools and communities. They would know every teacher in the school, and they would know what those teachers' plans were. They were able to identify really high performing teachers. But now they say they're lucky just to know the principal well enough to be able to have those conversations with them. So this has effects because they're much less likely to be able to guide and support principals to make strategic appointments that meet local needs. They don't know who's looking to move around or to take on new opportunities. And so they have to act quite reactively rather than proactively in relation to staffing. And the other thing that's really, basic about it is, of course, that the devolution of governance of schools also means that all of the basic administrative work of advertising positions, working through applications, all of that stuff is now the principal's job too. So when there's multiple shortages in a school, this obviously takes huge amounts of time out of a principal's already really busy workload, and it adds further pressures to their work. So the other element or the other lens about the additional work for leaders is really in this big picture leadership stuff that principals see as the work that they should be doing. So one of the critical things that principals see as being their role is to create environments where students can successfully engage in learning. They have a sense of responsibility for creating the conditions where good teaching and learning happens. And this is, really explicitly stated in policy as well, which requires them to act as instructional leaders. And part of that work is, of course, directly or indirectly developing teachers' skills and capacity. So many of you here today have done the research that has shown how important leaders are in these circumstances. So for example, I always go to Anna's work on the importance of school leaders in guiding and professionally developing teachers who are out of field. So it's no surprise to any of you, you know that your own research shows that school leaders who demonstrate an in-depth understanding of the experiences of out-of-field teachers are able to be most effective in supporting and developing them to become confident and expert teachers. But if we think about that through the lens of the issues and the circumstances that I mentioned earlier, so the time pressures, the challenges of them often being inexperienced themselves, they're far less likely to be able to have that understanding of those different experiences. They're far less likely to have the actual time to really deal with the implications of what they need to do, and to do that intense kind of developmental work with teachers as well. That is so important, and it's what they want to be doing. So our research and body of ed leadership research has shown that principals are consistently frustrated by administrivia that takes them away from what they see as leadership or what they want to be doing, and pulls them back into that administrative side of things instead. So they want to be able to do this work with teachers, but the time pressures often mean that when they have to distinguish between what's urgent and important, the urgent is often what wins out. So just one example of that, a principal who I studied in my PhD research, which was on school improvement policy, spoke about the fact that he had allocated himself to be a mentor for the Year 6 teacher. And as part of that, he wanted to go in regularly and observe and model new strategies for them and support them. But he had not been able to get into that classroom at that scheduled time once that year because something constantly came up. And even when I was in the interview talking with him about this, a child absconded from the school and we had to run out with the police and chase the kid. Like that's the reality of the work of a principal today. So, you know, even though they want to be doing that really important school improvement work, it's not necessarily always the way they can do it. So to kind of, I promise I'm not going to go over Claudette, to look then at the second question then, which is really around these questions of school improvement policy and how it can be more responsive. There's a couple of points that ASPA had asked me to make as well. So Andrew Pierpoint, the president of ASPA, he said, first of all, systems suggest that this is a bit of a problem, but the problem is actually much larger than it's recognised. And that's, you know, not going to be a surprise to anyone today. But ASPA's position here, and it's one that I wholeheartedly agree with, is that if we focus on school improvement is the outcome of having these things in place. If we focus on improvement first, we're putting the cart before the horse. Principals in our research, they believe that we are focusing on the right things. You know, they want their students to leave being literate and numerate. They understand their place in the world and all of that sort of really important stuff. But the way we go about doing it isn't right, and it's not working for school communities at large. So the way we do school improvement right now is really seen by a lot of principals as being one size fits all. It's not responsive to context and nuance. And of course, this is felt really deeply in the sorts of schools that I was speaking about before that we tend to describe as hard stuff for a range of reasons. The way principals are supervised and developed now also has a really big impact on this. It's very much done at a distance by numbers and spreadsheets. Principals will hear when things aren't up to scratch or if they're not meeting targets. And the thing that we've been arguing for some time is that systems or education departments need to recognise a much more nuanced picture of school improvement. We can't measure improvement by disembodied data because it does not tell the story of the work that's being done in schools or the different starting points. And if we're doing this developmental work with schools from a distance, there's not a sense that participants, supervisors are really able to get to know their school or community themselves. So like I spoke about HR before, principal supervisors used to really deeply know a school and a community and could tailor support for that school and community themselves effectively. The difference now is that in some places, supervisors are supervising over 50 schools at once. They may not have been principals themselves. They may not have taught or worked in the sorts of schools that they're now supervising. And they're stretched so thin themselves that it's not possible for them to really do that work in the way that everyone wants them to be able to do. So they have to go off this kind of disembodied data. So I think what we just wanted to kind of finish on here or note is that we really think that the way that we even think about school improvement at the moment is backwards. It doesn't recognise these challenges that we've talked about in this presentation. It doesn't recognise the challenges of or experiences of out-of-field teachers and teaching. And it just expects the same from everyone really, regardless of what the reality of the school is. And so the quote on the screen here, again, I think it reflects that experience that principals have. I wanted to just end by acknowledging, you know, these issues are really systemic, and it's really wonderful to see the way that you're approaching this summit by thinking from different perspectives. In ed leadership, we often talk about the fact that we often work in parallel monologues and don't talk to each other a lot within our own field. But the way that you're taking this approach, you know, looking at it from different perspectives really shows the power of collaborating across areas of interest to try to make different change, or, you know, make something different happen. And potentially we can address these challenges a little bit more effectively than we have in the past. So that's me. Thank you very much for having me here today. I really appreciate it.